You're tuned to The Voice of Russia. I'm Howell Davis, and today we're discussing China as its political elite looks set to select a new leader for a fifth of the world's population. Beijing is a city on high alert, with thousands of police officers deployed and vehicle checkpoints set up across the capital. It's all because China is about to see momentous change. More than 2,200 delegates from across the country have gathered for a Communist Party Congress that will see a new leader anointed. The Congress itself will play little part in deciding who that will be. But Xi Jinping, the son of a former comrade of Mao Zedong, is universally expected to replace President Hu Jintao at the top of the ruling Communist Party. His accession to the post has been decided upon by the party elite. He's also expected to assume the presidency in March next year. So who is Xi Jinping, and will he take China in a new direction? To answer these questions, I'm joined now on the line from Hong Kong by Joseph Cheng, Professor of Political Science at the City University of Hong Kong. From Nottingham University, we have Zhongshu Wang, Associate Professor of Contemporary Chinese Studies and Politics. While in the studio, I'm joined by Merlene Emerson, Chair of the Chinese Liberal Democrats, who's just returned from an official visit to China. And we also have here in London Rod Wai, Associate Fellow at the think tank Chatham House. So Rod Wai, who is Xi Jinping?
Well, he is the man who the Chinese Communist Party has decided will be their next leader for the next 10 years. He is the son of a very prominent Chinese communist revolutionary, and he has many years' experience in China as a provincial governor in the provinces of Fujian and also, I think, in Shanghai. And he has, not so long ago, been promoted to vice president, vice chairman of the Chinese the Central Military Commission, and is the man who is set to take over for the next 10 years.
Professor Cheng, I suppose the big question is, will he be any different from what the last 10 years has produced for China? Is he any different politically? What is he looking to do you think?
We really don't know, because as the anointed heir apparent, as you said, his best strategy has been to lie low, not to antagonize anyone, not to reveal his true ideological and political orientations. This is the best way to make sure that he can succeed Hu Jintao. And that was also Hu Jintao's strategy while he was the heir apparent. One may say that there is a rather strong path-dependent orientation, because there is a strong consensus within the party on economic reforms, but there is no consensus at all on political reforms. Basically, the party is not ready to give up its monopoly of political power. And in order to initiate new bold measures, the new leaders have first to consolidate power, then to build a consensus within the party, and then to overcome the resistance of the vested interests. This is a very challenging task.
Mr. Wang, do you agree with that he's a bit of a cipher and we don't really know what he stands for?
In a sense, yes, Professor Chen made a very good point that as a successor, he has to, and he has been hiding his ambition in his real ideological leaning. But given his background and his experience, we can expect he can be more forthcoming, more progressive in terms of pushing reform forward. But in terms of reform, we are talking about structural reform to the economy and probably reforms to the some of the government institutions, especially at the local level. But we are not talking about any reform that's aiming to introduce multi-party election in China or a real democratization of China. So in terms of party rule of the country, Xi Jinping is going to continue with the classic or traditional Chinese way.
Ms. Emerson, you've just returned from China. Is one of the worries at the moment, and we'll go back to the politics in a second, that the economy is slowing? Did you notice that when you were there?
I think we can see the impact of the global downturn affecting China, especially if the European market's not buying as much Chinese goods. But I think in China, they also have this optimism because they know that they can do a lot For example, having the rural migration into the towns, if they manage that better, there's going to be a lot more labor coming into the market. And they are very much aware of the problems that they face, for example, the widening gap between the rich and the poor. So I think the Chinese government, what they do have on their side is they work almost by consensus. We talk about one leader as if he's going to be the anointed one, the dictator, the one who's going to make all things happen. But they do have a very complex structure. As we know, there are over 2,000 delegates coming together for the 18th, the 18th People's Congress. And then there are going to be over 300 people in the Central Committee. And then the speculation now is, are there going to be 7 or 9 in the Standing Committee? So they will work almost within the committees, and I think they will be very pragmatic. They will not steer too far from what has been mapped up in the last 10 years. But what will be very exciting is once the consolidation of power is there, we may see new shoots, of reform.
So, Professor Wang, you seem to hint that there might actually be more reform than we would expect from a Communist Party leader.
Yeah, I think, and Professor Chen also mentioned that there is a consensus in the party that reform has to be pushed forward. And, same things in the leaders' research teams, they have identified areas where reforms are needed.
But when you say reform, what do you expect would actually be different on the ground in China in political terms?
Politically, not very different, because they will still maintain the party's control of the economy of the state. But in terms of how to restructure the economy, for example, to reduce the role of the state-owned enterprises, to introduce more competition to the financial sector, to give more access to finance to the small and medium-sized enterprises. So they will aim to push some reforms in these areas.
So this is more or less what we've been seeing in China since Deng Xiaoping was there, e.g. the party retains complete control but gives away economic freedom. Rod, why is that? How you see it?
First of all, 10 years is a long time in politics, so we just do not know exactly what the challenges Mr. Xi will face and how he will face them. I think there are rising pressures in China for some kind of political reform movement, whatever you call it. You see a lot of demonstrations, for example, over environmental issues, over land requisitioning. You see a lot of people who feel that they don't have a voice in what is happening in China. You also see a strong growth of nationalism in China. It also wants to have its voice in the way that politics is conducted. So I think the new leaders will find themselves under pressure as time goes by to respond to these new forces in Chinese society. I totally agree with others that one of the key sort of messages from the Chinese Communist Party is that they always wish to maintain control over the political processes. But they will need to find ways to bring more voices into those political processes.
You're tuned to The Voice of Russia. I'm Howell Davis, and today we're discussing China as it looks set to select a new leader. I'm joined down the line from Hong Kong by Joseph Cheng, Professor of Political Science at the City University of Hong Kong. From Nottingham University, we have Zhengshu Wang, Associate Professor of Contemporary Chinese Studies and Politics, while in the studio I'm joined by Merlene Emerson, Chair of the Chinese Liberal Democrats, and we also have Rod Wai, Associate Fellow at the think tank Chatham House. Professor Cheng, are we in danger here of perhaps saying that this is what the Communist Party will think when actually even the Politburo itself is split into factions?
Yes, there is such a danger. The new leadership, for example, will probably be handicapped by the influence of the elders. In this case, there are two sets of elders, one headed by Jiang Zemin, the past leader, the other set headed by Hu Jintao, the outgoing leader. And it may be rather difficult to reach a consensus. And when there is a deadlock, these party elders may choose to exert their influences. But as said before, the pressure for reform is accumulating. As pointed out by various panel members, you have more and more unrest in the society. There is an accumulation of grievances. The party response tends to be more responsive to these needs, and the party's formula appears to be economic growth plus a basic social security net covering the entire population, and this certainly certainly has been a major contribution on the part of Jintao and Jiabao, plus good governance in the absence of democracy. That is to say, the cadre corps has to be more responsive, more accountable, a bit more competition within the party, and there will be more emphasis on peer reviews, public opinion surveys to gauge the performance of the cadres and so on.
Is the party becoming increasingly worried by the rise of social media?
Certainly so. The mobilization through the internet, through internet communications, has been demonstrated to be very substantial. The party certainly has adopted all types of measures to control the processes. This is certainly a very important innovation, so to speak, liberating the people, enabling the people to get organized, to get mobilized, and to exert pressure on the authorities.
Professor Wang, isn't it significant that you do have this sort of movement of social media and also seems to be an increasing amount of unrest? But we mustn't understate how successful the party has been over the last 10 years.
That's correct. I think agree with the comment about the important role social media play in the Chinese life to provide them with a way for expression, and the party is trying to actually manipulate or control the system at the same time. But meanwhile, we also need to be aware those people who do speak on the internet, they are mostly those extreme voices. They are the more of the radical voices instead of the moderate in the mainstream voices. So we recently see some data from China that in terms of people's judgment of local government's performance, they still heavily focusing on issues like housing, like urban development, like income equality. They are less interested in, say, government reform or participation or election. They're still less demanding in terms of the political opening. So the party still have some breathing space if they can still produce more economic growth to bring more equitable distribution of income to the people.
Mr. White, I mean, it's significant that the safety net for the health, for example, has spread very widely in China in recent years, beginnings of a welfare state.
That's correct. I think when we say the last 10 years, the Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao leadership has been slow in reform, we are saying they are slow in political reform. But actually, this team has focused mainly on the welfare and especially healthcare and pension system. And it has covered 90% of the Chinese population, which is a big deal. And if you talk to residents in the small towns, in villages, they are relatively speaking, they are very happy, let's say. They are happy with the recent gains in their welfare.
I mean, so why? 10 years ago, we were reading a lot about how many areas of China were missing out on the benefits of reform.
This was one of the sort of key elements of the policies of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, that they were very much about bringing people out of poverty, about spreading welfare, in some sort of standing in some contrast to the previous administration under Jiang Zemin, which had focused very much on development and getting rich quicker. Now the Hu Wen administration wanted to spread the advantages of economic development more widely, and they have been relatively successful in doing so.
Has that lessened the pressure for political reform? If people thinking, right, well, we're getting some benefits from this.
This has always been the deal that the Chinese Communist Party have offered, that we will bring political stability and we will bring economic and social development. But you, the Chinese people, have to give us political power. And it's a very sort of authoritarian, paternalistic view of how development goes. The Chinese Communist Party knows best. It will tell the people what they should be doing, and they in turn have generally been relatively content with what has happened, because we have seen, as others have said, remarkable developments in China. At the same time, there have been huge disparities in wealth generated. There are real problems, I think, and this is probably where one of the sort of weaknesses is, over accountability. Chinese officials, by and large, are not accountable to the people for their decisions, and some of those decisions affect people in a very deleterious way. And that is why we see the rising social instability. That is why we see these demonstrations. There is no effective way of calling government to account.
Professor Chen, would you agree with that? Because this does sound quite familiar from, say, 10 years ago. People were saying, well, it looks like people want more reform, and political reform, and it didn't actually happen, did it?
Well, we have not seen any serious political reforms in the past 10 years or so. The major contribution has been the building of the social security net. I think the Chinese leadership and the coming new leaders still enjoy a window of opportunity in the sense that a vast majority of Chinese people believe that they have been able to improve their living standards rather substantially in the past 30 years and more, and they still expect continuous improvement in living standards in the coming decade, and therefore they certainly seek no revolutions, and they see no alternative to Communist Party rule. It is also significant that in all these riots, demonstrations, and so on, the protesters tend to target against corrupt officials at the local level. They do not go against the central leadership. So there's considerable room for improvement, and there's still a healthy amount of respect and trust in the central leadership. I think the major points of breaking through we should observe will be, will there be more freedom for the mass media? Will there be more tolerance for non-governmental organizations' activities? That is to say, more tolerance for civil society, and perhaps even a bigger role for the People's Congress system at various levels to monitor the performance and the mistakes of the cadres.
You mentioned accountability. We've had, of course, the scandal of Bo Xilai. Do you think that has proved that the Communist Party knows how to cope with a major corruption scandal to most people in China?
Bo Xilai case is case of an ambitious politician trying to challenge the central leadership, and it appears that the central leadership of the party has no due process, no ready-made mechanisms to deal with this kind of subordination. Central leaders had to wait for a case to emerge in order to strike at Bo Xilai and remove him from power.
Merlin, did you notice Bo Xilai, people talking about that a lot in China?
Well, on our trip, we didn't think it appropriate to raise it. But I must say...
You were there with a group of parliamentarians, we should explain.
We were overseas Chinese politicians and came from 8 different countries. What we were showed, which is really the showcase that the Chinese government wanted to show us, we were taken to Sichuan, for example, to see how amazing the rebuilding was of those devastated villages, the uniting and coming together of the Chinese spirit of working together. And I think the rest of the world was very much touched.
But this is part of the propaganda effort, surely, of course.
Of course, but I think you can't deny that they have succeeded on that score with 10 years ahead of them.
Isn't the Sichuan earthquake a classic example of how government doesn't work? In that, the schools are all badly shoddily built, so they all fall down and kill lots of people, and then the media can't report it. It's covered up.
But what I'm saying, and I'm not being an apologist for the Chinese government, but what I'm saying is there are good points to having a strong government, as well as, of course, the weaknesses. And when we say it's not time for political experimentation, then my question is, if not now, when? It's been 100 years since the 1911 revolution and Sun Yat-sen and so forth. But they will take their time, and the priority is clearly economic and stability for the country. And what the people themselves want, they want to have food that is safe. They want to have fresh air, the pollution is a huge problem, and they want the children to have a good education. So until the basics are fixed, I think political freedom is second on the agenda.
No, I think the Bo Xilai case actually shows the party's inability to control corruption within the party. It only get exposed because there was a Wang Lijing case. Otherwise, the party wouldn't have had any method to stop this man called Bo Xilai. So the challenge for the party now is really, do you have any institution that can keep the government officials and party cadres to be accountable, to be transparent? And recently we had the scandal of Wen Jiabao's family wealth, family rich. So does the party want to introduce something to set up a transparency rule that the government officials need to publicize their family income, family wealth annually? Should they allow the People's Congress to to check the government officials. So they need such kind of institutions.
To some extent, there is no lack of institutions. You have, for example, the Anti-Corruption Bureau at the Supreme People's Procuratorate. You have the Ministry of Supervision within the government. You have the Central Discipline Commission and discipline commissions at all levels of the party. It requires tremendous political will for the leadership to tackle the issue of corruption. And the leadership understands that resistance will be terribly strong, and it will be very risky for the leadership to confront the issue of corruption head on. For example, the party has been calling for the declaration of assets on the part of the cadres for almost 20 years. And as mentioned before, the case of Bosilai, the reports on Jiabao and Xi Jinping, I think in the eyes of ordinary Chinese people, a similar story can be written for almost every single leader in China, with perhaps one or two exceptions like former Deputy Premier Wu Yi and so on.
So we're talking here about the New York Times report that Prime Minister Jiabao had assets of over or his family had assets of over $1 billion here. Is it fair to say that the Communist Party leadership is riddled with corruption, or is that a bit too strong?
Well, there is a lot of corruption within the entire cadre corps. I think, however, we have to distinguish two kinds of corruption, you see. The corruption in China allows competition and allows the economic system to function. That was a bit like the corruption in Hong Kong in the 50s and 60s before the establishment of our Independent Commission Against Corruption. Hong Kong also enjoyed considerable economic growth in the 1950s and 60s and early 70s as well. At the moment, this corruption has generated a lot of resentment among the people. But fortunately, with substantial economic growth, this resentment can be contained. I think Chinese leaders understand very well that the recipe for unrest would be corruption, abuse of power, plus the economic decline.
You're tuned to The Voice of Russia. I'm Howell Davis, and today we're discussing China as it looks set to select a new leader. I'm joined down the line from Hong Kong by Joseph Cheng, Professor of Political Science at the City University of Hong Kong. From Nottingham University, we have Zhongshu Wang, Associate Professor of Contemporary Chinese Studies and Politics, while in the studio I'm joined by Merlene Emerson, Chair of the Chinese Liberal Democrats, and we also have Rod Wai, Associate Fellow at the think tank Chatham House. Rod, why do you think we'll see a change in foreign policy in the next 10 years?
We have seen huge changes in Chinese foreign policy over the last 10 years and huge evolutions in Chinese foreign policy as China becomes much more part of the global system.
But do you think Xi Jinping will continue this path?
I think he has no choice but to. China becomes more involved in the world. Chinese foreign policy will have to become more important for China's leaders. And I think it's one of the sort of key things that we need to look at in the next few years is how much attention Chinese leaders do actually pay to foreign policy, because the decisions that China makes, both in its domestic policy and in its foreign policy, will have huge repercussions for the rest of the world. And this is an area, I think, that needs to be, in Chinese parlance, grasped more firmly.
Do you think we're going to see a more assertive China, or is that too simplistic? I mean, we have had this spat with Japan recently.
We have a China much more conscious of its interests, with much wider interests, prepared to defend its interests and promote its interests. What we need to be thinking of, I think, is treat it as a normal country, not to look at Chinese behavior as something strange and threatening. To look at it in terms, try to understand why the Chinese are behaving as they do, and try to understand what the Chinese interests are. And those interests will not always be coinciding with our interests, and we need to find ways in which we can handle those differences.
Professor Wang, is there a danger of a rise of nationalism in China that might be stoked by the government?
Well, I think that's a lesser issue, because the party is actually able to contain public opinion if it chooses to. the reason why recent protests emerged against Japan was because the government actually tolerates that expression. So if the government actually wants to control the public opinion, it can manage. I think the point I totally agree with Rose's assessment of the next 10 years of China's foreign policy evolution. I think the key point here we want to watch is China ready to become more active in the global institutions, global issues? At the moment, it is becoming more conscious of its interest in promoting its interests, but it gets involved only when things are related to China's interests. It's not yet ready to take more responsibility for global governance. It's only responding to challenges the world put on China.
Okay, we're almost out of time here, so I might just ask you, just give me one sentence how you think China will be different under Xi Jinping. If I might start with you, Rod Wai.
The problem is that we know so very little about what Chinese leaders actually think. They don't campaign in the way that Mr. Romney and Mr. Obama campaign. So we don't get a feel really for what their issues are, what their feelings on issues are. In the position that Mr. Xi occupied as sort of heir apparent, it was incumbent on him not to say anything different, significantly different from what his predecessors had said while they were still in power. He is definitely going to want to stamp his own authority and leave his own legacy. Quite what that legacy will be, the next few years will tell, but I personally just don't know.
Merlene Emerson, do you think it's difficult to tell at the moment?
Certainly, he will be consolidating his position for the first 2 years, perhaps, and then we may see the true Xi Jinping emerge, because there's going to be a lot of things once he's had the domestic situation under control that he will be looking at the rest of the world and making his mark. I hope China will play a more responsible role in the world, and certainly I'm looking forward to watching the next 5 years to 10 years.
Professor Cheng, we still don't know what he's going to do, basically, is what I gather so far from these two. What do you think?
I think the situation calls for serious economic and political reforms, while the window for opportunity still exists. As far as the economic reforms are concerned, there are serious challenges that a repetition of the existing economic development model may encounter increasing diminishing returns. And certainly people's dissatisfaction and grievances are gathering, and the government has to be seen to be responsive to that kind of demand for political reforms. But we agree that the new leadership has to consolidate power, get a consensus within the party, and overcome the resistance of the vested interests, which is a tremendously challenging task.
Professor Wang?
Yes, I think if you say how different China will be in the next 10 years, maybe I will sound more positive. I think the economy is going to be more equitably developing. So income disparity will be reduced, and then the environment will be more sustainable, and the government will be cleaner and more accountable, and then the legal system is going to be more competent in delivering legal justice. And
on that optimistic note, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks very much to Joseph Cheng, who's Professor of Political Science at City University in Hong Kong, Zhengshu Wang, Associate Professor of Contemporary Chinese Studies and Politics at Nottingham University, Merlene Emerson, Chair of the Chinese Liberal Democrats here in the UK, and Rod Wai, Associate Fellow at the think tank Chatham House. Thank you all very much indeed.
Say that there is a rather strong path-dependent orientation, because there is a strong consensus within the party on economic reforms, but there is no consensus at all on political reforms. Basically, the party is not ready to give up its monopoly of political power, and in order to initiate new bold measures, the new leaders have first to consolidate power, then to build a consensus within the party, and then to overcome the resistance of the vested interests. This is a very challenging task.
Mr. Wang, do you agree with that he's a bit of a cipher and we don't really know what he stands for?
In a sense, yes. Professor Chen made a very good point that as a successor, he has to, and he has been hiding his ambition in his real ideological
You're tuned to The Voice of Russia. I'm Howell Davis, and today we're discussing China as its political elite looks set to select a new leader for a fifth of the world's population. Beijing is a city on high alert, with thousands of police officers deployed and vehicle checkpoints set up across the capital. It's all because China is about to see momentous change. More than 2,200 delegates from across the country have gathered for a Communist Party Congress that will see a new leader anointed. The Congress itself will play little part in deciding who that will be. But Xi Jinping, the son of a former comrade of Mao Zedong, is universally expected to replace President Hu Jintao at the top of the ruling Communist Party. His accession to the post has been decided upon by the party elite. He's also expected to assume the presidency in March next year. So who is Xi Jinping, and will he take China in a new direction? To answer these questions, I'm joined now on the line from Hong Kong by Joseph Cheng, Professor of Political Science at the City University of Hong Kong. From Nottingham University, we have Zhongshu Wang, Associate Professor of Contemporary Chinese Studies and Politics. While in the studio, I'm joined by Merlene Emerson, Chair of the Chinese Liberal Democrats, who's just returned from an official visit to China. And we also have here in London Rod Wai, Associate Fellow at the think tank Chatham House. So Rod Wai, who is Xi Jinping?
Well, he is the man who the Chinese Communist Party has decided will be their next leader for the next 10 years. He is the son of a very prominent Chinese communist revolutionary, and he has many years' experience in China as a provincial governor in the provinces of Fujian and also, I think, in Shanghai. And he has, not so long ago, been promoted to vice president, vice chairman of the Chinese the Central Military Commission, and is the man who is set to take over for the next 10 years.
Professor Cheng, I suppose the big question is, will he be any different from what the last 10 years has produced for China? Is he any different politically? What is he looking to do you think?
We really don't know, because as the anointed heir apparent, as you said, his best strategy has been to lie low, not to antagonize anyone, not to reveal his true ideological and political orientations. This is the best way to make sure that he can succeed Hu Jintao. And that was also Hu Jintao's strategy while he was the heir apparent. One may
leaning. But given his background and his experience, we can expect he can be more forthcoming, more progressive in terms of pushing reform forward. But in terms of reform, we are talking about structural reform to the economy and probably reforms to the some of the government institutions, especially at the local level. But we are not talking about any reform that's aiming to introduce multi-party election in China or a real democratization of China. So in terms of party rule of the country, Xi Jinping is going to continue with the classic or traditional Chinese way.
Ms. Emerson, you've just returned from China. Is one of the worries at the moment, and we'll go back to the politics in a second, that the economy is slowing? Did you notice that when you were there?
I think we can see the impact